Good afternoon, and thanks for taking the time to join today's webinar with Diligent, 2018 Top 5 Cyber Risk Issues for Boards of Directors. My name is Diane Johnson, and I'm part of the marketing team at Diligent. I'm joined today by my colleagues Dottie Schindlinger, Vice President, Governance Technology Evangelist at Diligent, and Jeff Welgan, Executive Director at CyberVista. Before we get started today, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar should last about 45 minutes. It will be recorded and a replay will be sent out to all registrants shortly after this session. Please feel free to share the replay with your colleagues. Also, you can ask questions at any time by utilizing the questions pane in the GoToWebinar panel. Now I'd like to hand things over to Dottie and Jeff to take us through the rest of today's webinar.
Hi, thanks, Diane. Appreciate you hosting us, and Dottie, it's always a pleasure to do another webinar together.
Great to be here.
So we're really excited to talk to you guys about what to think about when we're looking at cybersecurity, cyber risk across 2018. I think the first place when you think about what's to come in this year, you have to really look back at the last year to kind of say, what has happened and what should be on our radar. So I'd like to start off by talking about some of the major incidents that happened in 2017. And first off, I want to start off with what I'd call the mother of all breaches, Equifax. I think everybody has heard about this. Everybody has probably been affected by this as well. But as you know, 145 million Americans' personal information was breached during this really, really large-scale breach. And now criminals are actually using that stolen information to apply for mortgages, credit cards, student loans. They're tapping into bank and debit accounts and filing false insurance claims and racking up substantial debts for people. So this has become a really big problem, not just for Equifax, but us as a society. This particular breach actually could surpass the $1 billion mark for total cost. So this is why we call it the Moab. In 2017, we also saw a lot of ransomware, particularly with WannaCry and NotPetya. These two incidents were kind of related. It was a result actually of a self-propagating network worm, something that kind of moves across networks on its own, that used leak NSA, National Security Agency, exploits. So stuff that happens in the government is they create in secret to do all kinds of adversarial things to other organizations or other nations specifically, got leaked out from an insider, and that insider, criminal groups have weaponized that particular tool and exploit to do really, really malicious things. So they weaponized it, put ransomware on it, and it affected thousands and thousands of companies. The NotPetya one was actually a more destructive variant of WannaCry, where it actually go through and delete files and really caused a lot of problems for big companies and small ones alike. But had really significant costs. Merck, for example, a pharmaceutical company, was impacted by WannaCry, and Maersk Shipping, both of them reported around $300 million in lost revenue in just one quarter. So these kind of operational disruptions were really significant in 2017. Another one that I'd like to cover is what I call the Yahoo oh no. Oh no, because the news just kept on dripping about the breach and how many people were actually affected by the Yahoo breach. And just kind of recap, where this really started was actually back in October of 2016. Yahoo was amidst an acquisition negotiation with Verizon, who was going to be buying Yahoo, and they had announced that there was a data breach back in 2013 that affected about 500 million users. Then they came out in December of 2016 and said that that breach affected 1 billion users. Oh. Yeah. So long story short, Verizon negotiated down that buying price from 4.8 billion to about 4.3 billion, and closed the deal back in June 2017. But then just a few months later, in October, new evidence showed that actually all of the Yahoo accounts were compromised, which was around 3 billion. Yeah. That included Yahoo, Tumblr, fantasy football and fantasy sports league stuff, and Flickr accounts. So this was just like an oh no moment, because it's like, oh no, more breaches, more affected from this particular breach. And then lastly, what I'd like to call the Uber 2016 breach covfefe. Unfortunately for Uber, they've had a really tough couple of years. So I just want to highlight some of the big pain points to see how this really actually came up to the covfefe moment. And you have to really look back to 2014 when we start with Uber. They had a variety of privacy issues that started to come to light, concerns that employees could spy on users' rides and location data, as well as not timely follow-ups to automated alerts that monitored access to that data internally. They were not responded to in a timely manner. Separately from that, in 2016, they had a series of sexual harassment scandals focused on their HR department, ignoring complaints. Then in 2016, also, some lawsuits were filed by Google's driverless car company, Waymo, that they were claiming that Uber hired a former employee, that was the Anthony Lewandowski, who was using Waymo's intellectual property to develop Uber's driverless car program. So having a series of issues over the last few years. Then we kind of fast forward to 2017. In August, Uber actually settled with the FTC back on that 2014 privacy issue and agreed to external privacy audits for the next 20 years. So think about it, 20 years of external audits around their privacy, with the first one due 180 days after that specific order that came out in August. And then in addition, the FTC also ordered, that order with the FTC also required Uber to submit its own compliance reports beginning in 1 year's time and sworn under the penalty of perjury. So this was a big, big deal for them, which really kind of takes us to this covfefe moment. And that really happened in November of 2017, when they announced that there was a data breach the year before, in 2016, that affected 57 million riders and drivers. What made this particular situation worse is that the Uber CEO, Travis Kalanick, knew about the breach a year earlier, back in 2016, and the company actually failed to report the incident to regulators, despite that ongoing battle with the FTC that they're having over those privacy issues. And they decided to pay $100,000 to the hackers who compromised their stuff to delete any of that compromised data and to keep it quiet. So some hush money. Wow. So it actually came out to light probably because of the orders of the FTC to report out and have these external audits, but also report out any issues under this threat of perjury too. So it really exposed this big, big issue. So 2017, no dull moment in the cyber breach, cyber risk news area. And what we're seeing here is an upward trend over year to year about these damages from these breaches that are now ranging in the billions globally, and they're estimated to exceed $6 trillion globally by 2021. So this is a big deal.
And so, you know, I think for all of us who've been watching the news and reading, you know, Google news alerts around cyber risk, you know, 2017 is a high watermark that I think none of us hope to repeat anytime soon. But I think as we start to look ahead to 2018, you know, Jeff and I were thinking about this webinar and putting together kind of our top 5 of things that we hope boards and senior leadership teams are going to be thinking about in 2018. You have to first take it in the backdrop of what happened in 2016 and 2017. I think there was a stat that I saw recently that said there were more breaches and attacks in the first 6 months of 2017 than there were the entire previous year. So I think it's, you know, look, it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get super better anytime soon. I don't think there's a single director or CEO out there that doesn't kind of already know that and understand that it's a big deal. So how do you focus your time? How do you sort of decide where to invest your time? I mean, obviously, it's not going to be practical for every single board member to become a cybersecurity expert overnight. That's not going to really be the right approach. But what we came up with was this list of 5 that we feel if you know, put a little energy behind it, put a little elbow grease into it, could really help to keep your company on the straight and narrow, and certainly help to avoid some of the covfefe moments that you saw others in the market have had in the past year. So our top 5, and not necessarily in exactly this order, but we'll talk a little bit about what's going on from the regulation front. There is quite a bit happening, not surprisingly at all, in response to these big public breaches and these big public outcries of the breaches on the regulatory front. So that's global, not just here in the U.S. We will talk about a few things that are happening at the state level in the U.S., as well as some conversations happening at the congressional level. We also want to talk about some of the big global trends that are happening, particularly in the EU with GDPR, new legislation that's come out in the Australia, New Zealand area. So we'll talk a little bit about what's happening globally as well. We'll also then spend some time talking about how things are evolving from a cyber threat environment perspective. There's a lot going on. You know, the bad actors are not, you know, kicking their feet back and saying, job well done, 2017, let's just, you know, go and retire now. They're just going to keep doing more and being better at it, and you know, being innovative and flexible about how they do this. So we're going to talk about what that landscape looks like. Then we're going to talk about how you can develop a better security focus for the leadership of your company, just some really practical steps. What can you actually do that won't drive everyone crazy, but is extremely important? And one of those things we'll dive into a little bit more deeply, the board and IT collaboration. So we'll talk a little bit about that, share with you some of the data around what's happening now. And then finally, hopefully just leave you on a note for how we can really kind of get away from what might have been seen as some complacency on the parts of leadership teams. Hopefully those are days of the past. Hopefully people everywhere, people understand this is something we have to take seriously and be proactive about. We can't just wait for something to happen and then figure out what to do. So we'll be talking about some specific steps you can take. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff. Do you want to talk a little bit about this?
No, I actually don't think I have anything else to add to this. I think the whole point of this webinar is really to leave you with some real key points that you can be armed with as you move into 2018, not only for your board, but for your organization, for your executives, and how can you bridge that gap between, you know, what is traditionally thought of as information security and the realm of responsibility there, with the responsibility that you have as directors and upholding your fiduciary duties and governing your own organization.
Great. So just to kind of kick us off, let's start by talking about some of the trends that are happening from the regulatory perspective globally. I'll talk about a few of these, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to talk about a couple of others. But let's just start from the highest level and work our way down. Hopefully, those of you that are joining us in this webinar today have heard people talking about this legislation, or excuse me, this regulation coming out of the EU called the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. And basically what the GDPR sought to do was to kind of pull together and update and modernize a number of different pieces of legislation and regulation that have been put in place over a period of time around data privacy. So the focus is all on how can companies and entities that are managing, processing, or storing any data for any citizen of the EU guarantee to that citizen that the data is both being protected, only being used the way the citizen gave explicit consent that it could be used, and that if that citizen changes their mind at any point in time, that they are allowed to be forgotten. And so GDPR really kind of focuses on those things. And then the outcome of it is that if a company is not abiding by those rules and sort of thinking about, you know, data protection by design and everything that they do, and they get fined for it, the fines are really draconian. So the number that hopefully you've heard and seen in the press, and is really truly the number, is that you can be fined up to 4% of annual worldwide revenue, or 20 million euros, whichever number is higher. So it's a serious penalty, and it would be an annual fee until you actually kind of, you know, get things back in order and are not doing the thing that they caught you on. In addition to that, there have been a number of conversations around jail time for executives and leadership members that sort of know something bad is happening, either try to hide it or allow it to continue even though they know that it's happening. So it's a big deal. And what we've been seeing is that, you know, this kind of came about, it was first, you know, voted on back in April 2016. It is going to go into effect on May 25th of 2018. So you don't have a ton of time to get ready if you've not started doing anything about it. Hurry. The clock is really ticking now. I think most companies have at least been talking to their IT teams about how to get ready for this regulation. And you may be thinking, well, this just affects companies in the EU, but in fact it doesn't. It actually extends to any company, any entity, anywhere in the world that in any way manages EU citizen data. So quite frankly, if you have a website, and if at any point at any time someone from the EU has filled out a form on that website, and you are using that person's information in a way that wasn't explicitly agreed to and stated on that web page, you potentially are breaching GDPR. Now, quite frankly, I think a lot of us that talk about these issues think they're going to have bigger fish to fry. At first, there's going to be a lot of activity. No one is really totally clear on how this is going to play out, how it's really going to be managed in the courts. There's a lot yet to see what happens. But it definitely is a good opportunity for us to just all make sure we've got our houses in order. And it's not just on the IT side. In fact, GDPR in some ways has bigger implications for your sales and marketing organizations than maybe any other part of your business. So if your marketing organization is doing a lot of, Google retargeting ads or collecting of lists from trade shows and then cold calling those people and asking them if they'd like to know about your products and services, you're going to have to really take some time and investigate that and make sure that nothing is being done inappropriately vis-a-vis GDPR. Because all of data, by the way, under GDPR isn't just bits and bytes, it's paper. So any way you get someone's information, it has to be protected against this regulation. What's interesting about that too then is, so even if your company isn't doing anything that could run afoul of GDPR, it's important for you to know at least a little bit about it and talk to your boards a little bit about it, because it is being used as a model in many other places in the world. In fact, the ones that we've got listed here have shades of GDPR baked into them. And there's one that we don't have listed here that has actually just gone into effect, is about to go into effect in February in Australia, which is kind of designed to be very much like GDPR. And the part of that legislation that is kind of interesting, they now have mandatory breach notification of something like 7 days, which I don't even know how that's possible, quite frankly, but we're going to see how it all plays out. In the meantime, here in the U.S., for those of you that are U.S.-based companies, there are some state regulations that you should be aware of. Probably the one that is the broadest in scope is the one that went into effect last March in New York, housed with the Department of Financial Services. And basically, this was a law that was meant to put additional provisions in place so that they could go after any financial service industry business that was, kind of not doing a good job of keeping data protected and keeping data privacy strong. And so the way that the legislation is worded is that any financial services institution that does business in the state of New York, which name me one that doesn't, kind of sure that means all of them everywhere, and any of their third-party vendors that service those companies. So name me a third-party vendor that doesn't have at least one financial services firm that works in New York. Yeah, I think that's kind of all of them. Are required to adhere to this regulation. And the regulation included some language in it that said that senior directors and officers have to not only sign off, but also certify that data protection programs are strong and are effective. That is new language. That is new information. And so what that means is that board members have to know what the data security teams are doing, and they have to know how the data security team is proving that those programs are effective. And if they don't know those things, they are held to account. They can see jail time, they can see fines, they can be brought in front of a court and asked some really hard, maybe very embarrassing, difficult questions. So these are some things that you should be paying attention to. And I know you've got a couple of other examples on here, might be worth talking about a little bit.
I mean, clearly from the state level, New York is kind of a model, and it has, for the board, the most implications, because in the requirements there, as a board, you're the chair of the board, you have to actually sign off and say, yep, we're compliant with these regulations. Now, Colorado and Vermont have also put out regulations that deal with those companies or entities dealing with securities, and it's very, very similar to what's going on in New York. What they don't have, that New York has, is that board level requirement. So New York says, hey, you got to put a CSO in place, and that CSO needs to report annually up to the board in written form about the policies that are based on a risk assessment that has been done. So Colorado, Vermont also have that risk assessment. They also require that you need to put policies and procedures in place for cybersecurity that align with that risk assessment. But it does not quite have that board sign-off piece. Now that said, there's kind of a dotted line there. You should know as director what your risks are. If we're basing policies and controls based on cybersecurity risks to your organization, and there's policies that are going policies in place to kind of manage those risks, it is your job to really understand and oversee risks. So it would behoove anybody who's on a board dealing with securities in these two states specifically, or any board that deals with any company, to really understand what their cybersecurity risks are, and in addition to that, really understand what's in place at an organization to deal with those risks. And I think our point here for 2018 is that what state and sector is really going to be next. Yeah. This is a wave that's coming. It's like a couple earthquakes have happened. We heard about those in the big 2017 incidents and 2016 incidents that we started off. They're like earthquakes out in the Pacific Ocean that are set off tidal waves. And this, in my opinion, is really the tidal wave to come, these big regulations. So we think about also social media and tech, Russian influence. Like, will California put out something for those in the tech industry that kind of regulates privacy and security risk? I don't know, but it's something to think about.
I think, yeah, that's really good, Jeff. And I think, maybe if we were just to kind of give you some guidance of what to do about this in your conversations with the board, I think one really valuable line of conversation would just be to say, hey, a lot of these regulations are going to be a bit confusing, and I would fully expect that when GDPR takes effect in May, it's going to be a little crazy for the first maybe even 18 months of that new piece of regulation. But what I would say is this is a good opportunity for boards to start asking the question, for every program that's put into place, how are we ensuring data privacy? That's a great question for board members to ask. So how are we ensuring data privacy with this program? Or at the very least, to hold the CEO accountable to say, how are you ensuring that your teams are making sure there's good data protection, data privacy in place? I think as we begin to kind of get used to this new normal of a breach happening every day, and as we all kind of understand that for every company out there, we are all at risk, and it's not really a question of whether or not we get hacked, but it's a question of when we actually do get hacked and how quickly we can rebound and respond. These are the right kinds of questions to be asking. How are we making sure that we're prepared for every new thing we do from a data privacy and data protection standpoint? And that's a really good segue to let Jeff tell you how scary things are going to be in 2018.
Yeah, so number 2 on our list is really getting your heads around the threat environment here and what you should keep your eye on in 2018. So we put together a list of 5 here, some big ones. The first one is really IoT attacks, or Internet of Things, will continue to increase. So as businesses continue to rely on connected devices to increase efficiencies, and individuals embrace the popularity of voice-enabled devices like Alexa or Google Home, and I know I have one in my home. It's kind of fun. It's great. But the risks that are posed by these the Internet of Things will actually rise with that. They aren't really built with security in mind, so it's important to think about that. So IoT devices will continue to contain significant vulnerabilities that expand the overall potential attack surface of homes and companies, making it likely that 2018 could potentially see some large-scale attacks, with little hope that these device developers and manufacturers start baking that security into their design.
I have a quick question for you, Jeff, because it's something that came up in a conversation I had the other day was, what sort of IoT devices are common in an office environment? Because I know things like Alexa, you're not likely to find that in the office, but there's a lot of wireless devices. So what would be some of the things they might want to kind of keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I mean, well, even it depends on the company, and it depends on how slick your office is sometimes. You could have the coffee makers and stuff like that in your office, sure, but I think where you're going to see a lot of the IoT vulnerabilities is where you find efficiencies in your lighting systems, your HVAC systems, smart buildings, and how smart buildings are evolving with the infrastructure. You're going to use AI and IoT to kind of help make physical brick and mortar facilities more efficient, but also more user-friendly and keeping up with the business operation. So I think that's really where you want to focus on that.
I know just one that I thought I would mention, because someone had mentioned this to me, that they did a little assessment in their office and discovered they had a lot of really old wireless printers that had a vulnerability baked in that with a very simple hack, you could go back and get a copy of anything that had ever come out of a printer, going back as far as the printer had been in use. And you can imagine the stuff that comes out, especially the one in the legal department, things that are coming off the printer in the legal department or in the contracts department or in the sales area or off the CEO's desk, the HR, exactly. So that to me made it real. Like, that made it more real to me than, okay, they could mess with the heating and the lighting and that might, cause a big disruption in business, but something like someone being able to literally lift copies of HR documents or, contracts, now that's a little more scary.
Yeah, and when you think about lighting and all that stuff, that's really the end point, right?
Yeah.
So there might be a vulnerability there, but how that's connected back to your network is where it gets scary. Because once you get into the network, then how do you move to something more valuable to the threat actor who might be compromising that system?
Yeah.
So number 2 on our list is really about ransomware and phishing attacks. We see this still persisting in 2018. Ransomware actually proved to be one of the most successful forms of digital extortion in 2017, as evidenced by the 2 issues that we raised at the beginning of this webinar. So cybercriminals will continue to leverage a fraud-based business model to trick even more organizations into siphoning money to them. Business email compromise also typically involves scammers targeting employees with access to financial accounts and tricking them into making fraudulent wire transfers. I can't tell you how many C-suite executives I talked to who mentioned, yeah, our CFO was spoofed, it's called spoofed, fake email from them asking for wire transfers. So this happens all the time. So keeping an eye on that is important. In fact, Trend Micro actually predicts that global losses in 2018 from business email compromise will exceed $9 billion. That's with a B dollars. So this is a big business. Cryptocurrencies, almost all financial activity currently utilizes cyber as a domain, and virtual currencies really have become a major economic force for all these in underdeveloped nations. And the explosion of cryptocurrencies in particular will further potential opportunities for cybercriminals to exploit the anonymity afforded in virtual currency exchanges for things like money laundering too. So keeping an eye on that and how that might actually disrupt regular currencies and is really important to kind of keep an eye on, especially with the explosion of Bitcoin doing so well this past year as a disruptor.
I'm curious to know how, that's interesting, I'm curious to know how much factors like, Bitcoin increasing in value exponentially impacts the fact that ransomware and phishing attacks are on the rise. I would bet that those 2 things are somewhat connected.
Yeah, it might be. I think someone would probably want to look into a little bit more, keep an eye out. Definitely good questions to be asking.
Well, just meaning that they can make a whole lot more money because the value of Bitcoin is so much higher. So they used to ask for certain shares of Bitcoin, and now those shares are worth 400% more than they were even a year ago. Yeah,
with ransomware attacks, I mean, that's typically how they're extorting money anyways, right? They make you create a Bitcoin account and transfer Bitcoin to them because it is harder to regulate that.
Yeah.
Another one I think not enough people are talking about, it's also kind of recent, was the end of net neutrality. This might actually provide some new avenues for exploitation. This is still pretty new, so there's a lot to keep an eye on here, but the debate over whether the FCC's recent ruling to repeal the net neutrality rules is unlikely to go anywhere in 2018, but there's also an interesting twist on how this might impact security. It really depends on how much transparency is imposed or not imposed on ISPs in reporting or blocking or throttling how they throttle that network traffic. So in addition to ISPs potentially collecting more data about its customers, they could inadvertently end up offering different internet quote-unquote markets based on the types of sites customers are willing to pay to access. So all of this could offer more opportunities for hackers who thrive in the privacy and shadows of less transparency. And then others argue that the repeal of the original net neutrality transparency requirements could actually lead to increased security, since it would allow ISPs to block or throttle potential bad traffic like denial of service attacks. So we'll really have to wait and see which of these scenarios is more likely in 2018, or if it's just kind of status quo as it has been. But it really kind of is in the ISP's hands right now on how they will handle that. And then lastly, the last one is really cyber propaganda. Will shape our view of the world. With the renewed attention on fake news, it's really easy to forget that propaganda is actually one of the oldest tricks in the books. So the 2016 election proved just how impactful social media and sensational news stories can be. In 2017, the term fake news itself was weaponized by officials and pundits who disagreed with publications or sites that conflicted with their own messaging. So not only will 2018 see the continued and even more widespread use of the internet and social media to spread misinformation and to influence public perception, but it will also continue to serve as a convenient battle cry to undercut trust in mainstream reporting and truth findings. So actually just last week, Business Insider reported on findings from, again, this was a Trend Micro reporting, warning on Russian efforts to spy on the U.S. Senate, similar to tactics we saw in the 2016 presidential election campaign. So 2018 was another election year, midterms. So this is a really important thing to keep an eye on. And then it doesn't just relate to politics. It relates to all kinds of misinformation. So it's really important to keep an eye on that. The last thing we want is, as business owners or directors, our information being exposed through some other compromise and being used as a means to influence the world one way or another. So really keep an eye on that.
That's a good list. Thank you. So kind of taking that from there, one of the things we want to talk a little bit about are, so what do you need to focus on? So I think we've given you kind of a list of the scary things happening for 2018, the things that happened in 2017. Excuse me for one moment. Sorry about that, still getting over a little bit of a cold. We wanted to share with you some very simple things that you can implement into your board meetings, into your boardroom, and just into the way that you approach this topic that hopefully will make a difference. So one of the things that we would strongly encourage you to think about is making regular cyber risk reporting a part of your board meeting, and to have formal opportunities throughout the year for ongoing training and practice. Again, if you take it as the premise that it is not a question of whether or not you will have one of these events at your company, but just when you're going to have an event like this at your company, it's so much better to be prepared before it becomes an issue than to wait until you're in the middle or in the throes of a situation. That is not the time to prepare your response. So in the guise of how can we help you to be better prepared, I want to share with you some specific ideas. Now, I know this is something that Jeff spends almost all of his time doing. He's always working with executives and boards on their risk response, their risk readiness, their posture. So do you want to talk about some of the things you've recommended that really seem to work well?
Yeah, and I'll apologize. I have 5 things to recommend here. I feel like, speaking of the Russian influence on propaganda, I feel like this webinar itself is its own little Russian nesting doll. It's like top 5 things you should be looking at 2018.
Are you saying that this is propaganda?
No.
That's what you're saying.
With all these little top 5 things buried into it. So here are my 5 best practices for directors. Number 1, be proactively proactive. I cannot stress the importance of staying on top of this and not just having it be, well, we did this one thing, so we're good, check the box, and then never visit again, or put it on the agenda for something that's in 2021. This is something you have to do on a recurring basis, and you have to be really proactive about it, because that proactivity really can save you when something bad happens and you need to restore that confidence with your shareholders, stakeholders, with regulators. If you can show them that you've been working this diligently, that you'll be ahead of the game. Number 2, you really want to ensure that you have a cyber training programs in place. And this isn't just for your general staff, but it's for your executives and boards as well. So in addition to good cybersecurity hygiene, directors and executives have a responsibility to govern or manage cyber risk. And this is where programs like our CyberVista's Resolve program come into play, where we can help you with a training program on how do you think about cyber risk and how do you prioritize the initiatives and policies and controls that maybe your information security team leads are coming to you with. Number 3 is practice. You need to practice your knowledge and your response plans using some sort of tabletop exercise or other ways to really keep that muscle memory in place. You can put a policy and a plan in place, but unless you actually kind of go through the process of doing it, you really won't be able to understand it the same way. It also gives you the opportunity to find the weaknesses and the strengths in that policy, where you can make some improvements. And that should be done on an annual basis. Number 4 is you really want to conduct some sort of regular cybersecurity audits, not just on your own internal programs, but really also about your what we call an attack surface, your business partners, the others who have touch points into your organization, your third-party suppliers, vendors, if you're doing M&As or you're divesting. All those are really important to kind of go through the process of determining whether an audit is necessary for those partnerships, or what type of audit is necessary for that. Sometimes you can just ask for a checklist. Sometimes you might actually want to go through the whole process of the full-blown IT audit. You wouldn't buy a house without kind of first going through a home inspection. Kind of think of it that way. And then lastly is really implementing, if you don't have one already, a cyber risk scorecard, so you can start measuring and tracking your cyber risk over time.
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great list. And by the way, for those that didn't hear the announcements at the beginning, we will be sending out not only the slides, but a link to the recording of this session, because I know Jeff is just a wealth of knowledge. So if you want to kind of catch some of the script and some of the things that we are rattling off to you, that'll definitely be something you'll get. But I wanted to just go back and echo one of the points you made about doing regular cybersecurity audits, and just put in a plug for when you do those audits, please, please, please do not forget to review how the board and senior leadership is communicating. And the reason I say that is we did some research earlier last year to try to understand, is that in fact happening ever? Are we taking a moment as companies to figure out when we send documents to our board members, what happens to those? Are they getting adequate training and support to make sure those are always being kept secure? And we really kind of came back with the data saying that's a resounding no. That's just not happening. And the unfortunate truth is directors and senior executives of companies are really kind of the most at risk. It's for two reasons. One is they tend to have the most juicy information. They tend to have all the keys to get at any of the information in the company. But they also, because of the nature of their positions, tend to have the least amount of direct oversight by the CISO and the data security team. And so that's kind of a reason why they are more at risk maybe than others would be. And frankly, especially if you're a public company, you probably have the list of all of your board members proudly displayed on your website as you need to. You need to disclose who they are. But what that means is it becomes pretty easy for a bad actor to send a phishing email spoofing as if it's coming from a director, as if it's coming from the CFO or from the CEO, and institute an attack. And if it comes to the right executive, they may receive 500, 600 emails a day, and in the course of just running through their inbox, just hit okay, 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 and it looks legit. It's got the logo on it. It's from the right person. They don't give it 2 seconds worth of thought, and now they've just created a loophole for a bad actor to go in and do some damage. So it's definitely worth it to take some time and say, okay, how are these individuals communicating? Can we put them on some more secured channels? Can we kind of get them off of email? Let's just get them off email, put them onto a secure messaging site, closed loop, maybe something integrated with your board software. Like, let's just think this through differently. And it certainly could end up being slightly less convenient than just using your personal email, but the exponential payoff in not having really sensitive information being subject to higher levels of cyber risk, maybe that inconvenience is worth it. So definitely take some time and include in that audit the people that might be at risk that you may not have thought about before.
And I would just add to that real quick, too, that some of the regulations that we talked about earlier, DFS, Vermont, Colorado, how those companies are using electronic communication, or how they're authenticating the practices for employee access to electronic communications, databases, and media, is all part of the things they say you should do a risk assessment on and have a policy in place to address those specific risks. They specifically called them out.
Right.
So just kind of keep that in mind, that this is definitely an important area to really lock down and secure.
I think that's exactly right. And that gives us kind of a good segue to one of our final couple points here, which is, as we just talked about, making sure that there's this alignment between IT and senior leadership and the board is going to be part of that process. So Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about what needs to happen there?
Yeah, so I mean, my number 5 on my last slide was implement a cyber risk scorecard so you can track and measure risk. So to do that, you really need to spend more time with your CISO, your CIO, or your chief risk officer, whoever's owning this risk on their day-to-day job and responsibility. You need to get involved with them to start getting your heads and hands around cyber risk issues. And that really starts with having some conversations and getting some meetings in place where it's a regular agenda item. One really interesting stat that is up here is that 14% of boards have added a member with cyber experience in the past 2 years. This came from a Deloitte 2016 report. That's great to have board members who have experience in this, but I will put out a caution that you don't want to bring on the cybersecurity expert, have them sit on your board, and then use them as the scapegoat, or constantly look to them and say, like, oh, Dottie, what do we do about this? You're the cyber expert. It's everybody's responsibility. When something bad happens, the whole board is responsible, not just one person. So it's great to have that knowledge on this area really needs to come up. The tide needs to rise with it. So it's really important. Actually, and then NACD put out a study last year that said 59% of directors find cyber risk very challenging to oversee, and then 56% of those, or 56%, believe that the board spends too little time on director education. So this is a really key observation, especially when you're considering the impacts of a breach. The average cost of total cost of a breach is now at $7.35 million across all industries. So big impacts, not enough education. It's time to actually get around onto this issue.
Yeah.
And then the other stats here: more than a third of boards evaluate the health of a company's risk culture. That actually came from NACD as well. 48% of boards believe it's important to improve the metrics used to evaluate performance. So you need to actually have a way to scorecard this and see it regularly, to track it, and that's really where having time with a CISO, CIO, CRO, and a scorecard come into place.
Yeah, I think that's all totally right on, and I just want to echo your call for it. Look, it's great to add someone with cyber experience to the board, but don't think that that's just the solve for every ill.
Yeah.
It's just so funny to me. I mean, here you have this incredibly giant source of risk for the company, and yet somehow it still seems to be okay for board members and senior execs to not really know much about it. And if you just change the word cyber to finance, and then ask yourself, would it be okay if a board member said, you know what, I don't really know anything about finance, so I'm not really going to talk about finance. That's someone else's problem. Would they be tolerated?
Let's defer to our finance board member.
Exactly. Like, so I think it's just, cyber kind of has this rap of being someone else's issue, and I just think we have to kind of stop that thinking. I think it's well nigh time. So with that in mind, just to kind of wrap up here, and then we can have a couple questions. This I think kind of goes without saying. This is what we've been beating this drum probably this entire webinar, but we really hope that 2018 is the time when boards just end that feeling of complacency if they had it. Some boards certainly did not. It's not fair to say every company is complacent. That's not true. But what I think we have seen with all these giant breaches and all the things that have been happening is that the vast majority of directors just don't feel fully prepared. They feel a little vulnerable. And frankly, unfortunately, they are vulnerable. They are definitely in the crosshairs. It is definitely time to do more. And so, we've said a couple of these things before, but just some additional information that might be helpful. The 31% of the board is now attending continuing education events on cyber risk. That's good. I think that number could really stand to go a lot higher. I think, I think you've got some other interesting information on here. The only thing I would add to this is just to say, when we did our research last year and we asked things like, is your board required to participate in any cybersecurity training? More than 2/3 said no. I think that's a really easy place to start. Look, even if it's just annual, just get some training in their hands. It doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to take a ton of time, but it is so incredibly important. And I think an annual approach is definitely good. Don't think of it as, well, we did that was 5 years ago. Well, look at what's changed in terms of cyber attacks in 5 years. I mean, that's just not sufficient. So I think just raising the level of awareness, having an ongoing conversation is really important. I don't know if you want to cover just briefly some of these, and then we'll maybe take a question to wrap up here.
I think the last thing I would say here is that you really need to know the difference between cyber risk information, cyber risk awareness, and cyber risk education. And I think what you're seeing some of these numbers is really in the more awareness and information camp than actual education.
Yeah.
If you're going to conferences where you hear that, General Hayden got up there and did the 60-minute great speech on cyber risk, that's really not education. It's a really good conference. Yeah, it's awareness. So you might get some insight, but it's not taking you through the process of like really understanding the risk issue and then knowing what to do about it. And that kind of gets to this point of like, it's not a once and done thing. And it's not, this second to last bullet about 2/3 reporting that their boards have a high level of awareness of cybersecurity specific to their companies. I saw that stat and I was like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
What is high level of awareness? These are things that you should be drilling down to actually start getting better metrics on, and it's provable what that awareness looks like or that education looks like. And that's where, companies like CyberVista, my program, really come into play. We'll work with boards and executives and taking them through a framework to really understand risk and manage that and govern it, and work with your head of information security to kind of give you that update in addition to the literacy. So it's all focused on the business risk, but we're talking about cyber risk when we're doing that particular program. We're going to be rolling out a digital version of that soon here in this first quarter. So yeah, check us out if you're interested in board education. We've got some really great programs.
That's great. Yeah, and I just want to put in a plug for Jeff and CyberVista. They really are exceptional. They do really, really good work. And one of the things that, you know, we'll bring to the table, Diligent, is, you know, look, we provide some tools that I think help make the directors and the senior executives stay a bit more secure in terms of their communications, but also can be part of the overall posture that the company begins to assume, and maybe make it a little bit easier for them to communicate risk reports and other things without having to, you know, print them out on that hackable wireless printer and mail them through the mail and all those sorts of things, making that a little bit easier. Well, we are, believe it or not, we are basically at time. You know, I think we did get a couple of really good questions coming in. I saw a couple of things come in over the system here. So, Diane, I think what we might do, since we're at time, rather than keeping people on the phone, is just commit to jotting down some answers and sending those out to everybody as a follow-up. But I'll give it back over to you to just wrap us up.
Terrific. Thank you, Jeff and Dottie. And I'd like to thank all of you that are joining us today. As a reminder, a replay of this webinar will be sent out to you shortly. Again, thank you and have a great day.